Okay, this is Chapter 7 review. Here we talked about photosynthesis. That's the focus of this chapter. We're taking carbon dioxide and water, and we're taking light energy and converting all of that into glucose and oxygen. Here, oxygen is going to be actually a byproduct. Okay, so what is photosynthesis? That's what you need to know. What is photosynthesis? Also, what goes into photosynthesis? What comes out of photosynthesis? That's another important point. Water goes into photosynthesis. CO2 goes into photosynthesis. Oxygen comes out of photosynthesis, and glucose comes out of photosynthesis. What's the water used for? Well, we're going to split water and use that as a source of electrons and protons. The oxygen in water, the O and H2O, that's going to come off as a waste product. If you see on the bottom, it says 6O2 oxygen. That oxygen is derived from the water on the far left. Okay, next let's look at that CO2. Let's see that 6CO2 carbon dioxide. It should be on your left side, on the bottom. Okay, that carbon is going to be the source of the carbon in the glucose. Okay, so if you look at glucose on the far right, C6H12O6, the carbon in the glucose ultimately comes from the carbon in the carbon dioxide on the far left. And how it makes that glucose is by the action of light energy from the sun and enzymes. That is photosynthesis. Okay. So what do we need to know? What goes in, what comes out, and the functions of these molecules. Water, source of hydrogen, protons, and electrons. Carbon dioxide, source of carbon for glucose. Oxygen, that's a byproduct. As water was split and used the protons and the electrons, oxygen is left over. That is a byproduct, a waste product in a sense. And glucose, that's going to be a long-term energy storage molecule. Some other uses for that we'll talk about later. Okay, what's the point here? Well, know that light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and also that the EM spectrum differs on wavelength. So visible light has a specified zone of wavelength of light. Past that, you have X-rays, microwaves. Not too concerned you know that. Just understand that light, visible light, is just a form of electromagnetic radiation. It's a form at a particular wavelength. That's the important point. What's a pigment? A pigment is just something that absorbs light wavelength at a specific wavelength. Okay. This is going to absorb specific wavelengths of light. An example of a pigment is chlorophyll A. That's going to absorb specific wavelengths of light. Also, one other thing about pigments and wavelengths, let me just come back to this point. As you change wavelength, you change color. Okay. So, for example, if you see something that purple, okay, that is 400 nanometers wavelength of light. If you see something yellow, that's about 600 nanometers wavelength of light. Now, you don't need to memorize the wavelength and the colors. Just know that as you change color, you change wavelength of light. So as you change color, you change the wavelength of the light that color is from. Also with pigments, when you see a color, for example, let's think of an apple and a tree. So you think of an apple and a tree. There's a red apple and there's a green leaf, right? Okay, so we got that in our minds. You close your eyes and you think of a red apple and a green leaf. Well, that red apple, that's absorbing a lot of light, but it's reflecting red light. So if you see something that's red like an apple, that's because it's absorbing other light, but it's reflecting red light. And that reflected light then goes to your eye. That's why an apple looks red, because it's reflecting that wavelengths of light. Same thing with why that leaf around it's green, because it's reflecting light that looks to us to be green light. It's reflecting it. It's absorbing the other light, but it's reflecting some other light that we perceive as being green. Okay, so color is really the reflection of that light. Okay. Okay, the other thing with pigments I want you to know, first of all, let's say this. You should know what a pigment is. Okay, it's a molecule that absorbs at a specific wavelength of light. Also understand that what? Different pigments absorb at different wavelengths. So there's lots of different pigments that the plants can use, and these are going to absorb energy at different wavelengths. When it absorbs this energy, it's going to direct that energy to the formation of chemical bonds in photosynthesis. Okay, so see the spikes, and it shows light absorption and it spikes, right? So chlorophyll A, we see light absorption at about 650 nanometers. When it absorbs that light, it's going to excite some electrons in that pigment, and that excitation is the transfer of energy from the sunlight ultimately to a chemical form of energy down the road and processes afterwards. Okay, but the point here is what? The light absorbed will be energy absorbed. Energy absorbed goes to photosynthesis. What's a phototroph and what's an autotroph? You should know the definitions for autotroph and phototroph. Autotroph, these are going to be organisms that bring in carbon dioxide and make their food from that carbon dioxide. And typically these energy from the sun. But autotrophs, they're going to use carbon dioxide as their source of carbon. Phototrophs are going to use light energy as their source of energy. Okay. So autotrophs are going to use inorganic sources of carbon, such as CO2. Phototrophs are going to use light energy. Plants are photoautotrophs. So all that means is that plants are autotrophs, plants are phototrophs. We take those and combine them to make one word, photoautotroph. Okay, so what do I want you to know about the test on this? What's an autotroph? They bring in carbon dioxide as their source of carbon. What's a phototroph? They use light energy as their source of energy. We combine those two words and we say photoautotrophs, and that's what does photosynthesis. Now, we don't say autotrophs, phototrophs, or phototrophs, autotrophs, because why say trophs two times? So what we do is kind of like an abbreviation. We take that trophs, and instead of saying it twice, we just say it once. So that's how we get that photoautotrophs. Okay. Point here is what? That because photosynthesis releases oxygen as a byproduct, there's been changes to the atmosphere. There's been changes to life because of the oxygen that those plants, for the most part, some bacteria they release. Okay. So the process, photosynthesis, has changed Earth. A chloroplast, that's where we're going to do photosynthesis. That's the major one here. Is what is a chloroplast? That's the organelle that we're going to do this in plants and some protists to do photosynthesis. Okay, photosynthesis has two reactions, a light-dependent reaction and a light-independent reaction. What you see below here is the light-dependent reaction. This has to have light to work. Okay. We also have a light-independent reaction. We'll talk about that later. We're talking about an overview of photosynthesis now. Just know that photosynthesis has two distinct reactions. One that requires light, one that does not require light. You might have heard these as the light and the dark reactions in other places. Okay. Okay. Photosynthesis, this was the lecture after, this was the second day's lecture on it, and I tried to bring this picture in to make a point. You should know this. Photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water go in. Sunlight energy goes in. What comes out? Oxygen. What's formed as by combining this carbon dioxide and sunlight energy? Glucose, carbohydrates. So know what goes in and know what comes out of photosynthesis. And that's just another description of what photosynthesis is. We're taking light energy from the sun and we're converting it to potential energy in the form of a chemical bond. That's all photosynthesis is. It's a conversion of energy forms from that light energy to chemical energy. There's two photosystems. We're going to show you a picture of that in a minute. Just know there's two photosystems. Okay, these are the photosystems, and I'm going to go from left to right. And this diagram is a picture looking at it from the point of the energy in an electron. Okay, so let's look at the left. See, it says splitting of water releases oxygen, and then the 1. Okay, let's start there. So what happens? Light energy comes in here. Okay, and that's going. And before we said what? That there are multiple pigments per photosystem. So all of those pigments are going to absorb, pull in, act like antennas, and pull in the light energy in that photosystem too. And so it's going to pull in all that energy, and it's going to direct all of that energy to one particular cluster of pigments. And that directing all that energy to one will super focus that energy, and that will raise an electron, or actually 2 electrons, to a higher energy level. Okay, so you're super exciting an electron. Think of an electron just, you see where it says P680 in the lower left, and it has a yellow arrow going up? As it goes up, think about an electron shaking, vibrating, seething with the energy. That's what's going on here. The light energy from the sun is super exciting an electron, or 2 electrons, and it's just shaking and just seething with energy. I'm shaking my hands when I do this. Okay, so it's the sunlight, by the actions of the pigments absorbing that light, they transfer that energy to a few electrons, and that super ultra excites those electrons, and it raises them up. And if you look on the far left, it says energy of electrons. You see how that has an arrow going up? Well, the energy of these electrons is increased. Okay, so the energy of the electrons is increased because it has absorbed light energy. Okay, so that energy from the sun has increased the energy of the electrons in the photosystem. Here, photosystem 2. Also, look, you see it says H2O and O2 in the corner. What's happened is that source of electrons, this thing has to have a source of electrons. It's going to take water and split it. And one of the functions of water here is to be the source of electrons in the photosystem. So these super excited electrons, they have to come from somewhere, and that comes from water. Now in the process, look what happens. You see the red dot and a white O2 in it? Well, oxygen is being released. Then those electrons transfer between different proteins, and that's a redox reaction. Remember the redox where some are gaining electrons, some are losing electrons? As it does that, we'll talk about this in a few slides, but it's making this, it will ultimately be the source of making ATP. So these electrons coming down this hill, it's a cytochrome complex, that's going to make ATP. We'll talk about how it makes ATP in a minute, but let's just say for now, that reaction makes ATP. Okay. So now we're at photosystem 1, P700. Same thing's happening here. That light from the sun is super exciting those electrons. So they're raising them up even more, one more time. So they raise them up in energy, they super excite them. And as those electrons come down, that's going to lead to the production of ATP and NADPH. Okay? So we're getting sources of ATP here. This is what it amounts to. This is the one from your book. What it's trying to say is what I've been saying. Starting from the left, we have photosystem P680, and the light energy super excites some electrons. Right? And those electrons, as they come down, they're going to be releasing what ultimately will be ATP. Goes to another photosystem, and light energy goes into that. It super excites those electrons, and it raises them up another time. And as it comes down, it's also going to be forming energy carriers. That's the point. Okay. This is a more molecular view of what's going on. Okay, same idea, but just more of a molecular view. So let's start from the left and work to the right. So we look at the far left and we see an oxygen, which it should be red to pink, and two hydrogens, which are blue. What happens is we take some electrons off of that water. You see those two yellow E's with a pink arrow? Okay, those are the electrons removed from water. We also remove some H plus protons. Those are those H pluses a little bit to the right. That leaves us oxygen left over. That oxygen's a byproduct. That's why oxygen is released. Okay, now look at that oxygen. It says photosystem 2 in light energy. Do you see that in the far left? Well, light energy hits that photosystem, raises those electrons up in energy, and as they come down through the electron transfer chain, they're going to make the conditions to make ATP. And what they're really doing is bringing in H plus protons and forming what we call a gradient, a high concentration of H plus inside. Ultimately, this will lead to the formation of ATP. Okay, so those electrons, we go to photosystem 1, which is kind of in the middle of this diagram. Same thing happens. That electron's super excited by the light energy. As it's super excited by that light energy, what happens? And so those electrons raise in energy, and they come down in energy, and as they do that, they're going to release, or they're going to form NADPH. Now, let's look at the far right here. It says ATP synthase. Those protons are going to go through ATP synthase, and as they go through ATP synthase, they're going to spin ATP synthase, and that's going to make ATP. Now, the reason it can make ATP is because there's a lot of hydrogen protons inside. The reason there's a lot of hydrogen protons is because the electrons, seeing in photosystem 2, their actions help to bring in those protons. So they built up a gradient inside. And that gradient inside moves through ATP synthase and makes ATP. So what's the take home here? Well, one, how about that oxygen and hydrogens? What do those do with that? Why is water split here? What happens when you split water in the far left? Oxygen comes off, electrons come off, and those protons come off, and they all have a function. Notice what happens. Photosystem 2, light energy goes in. Photosystem 1, light energy goes in. So we're super exciting electrons. And ultimately, this action will make ATP. This is going to make ATP, which is a short-term energy carrier. And this all goes to the Calvin cycle. This is the Calvin cycle. Look at the far left, that's what we've been talking about. That is the light-dependent reactions. Now we're going to go to the light-independent reactions. Just another picture from your book, but just making the point that what comes out of the light-dependent reactions goes into the light-independent reactions. What goes into the light-dependent reactions? Water and sunlight. What comes out? Oxygen, NADPH, and ATP. What goes into the light-dependent reaction? Carbon dioxide. What comes out? Sugars, NADP and ATP. Those sugars are the source of long-term energy. The bonds that hold those sugars together are made with the energy from sunlight, ultimately. No, you don't need to know this. What's the point here? Carbon dioxide enters a Calvin cycle. So let's look at this. Let's look at this cycle. Let's look at the far upper right. It says 3CO2, right? Well, that 3 carbon dioxides are going to form the carbon of the sugar. Okay. Now look what happens in the cycle. What's happening? ATP and NADPH are both being put into it. So they're the source of energy. Those are like the $20 bills. Okay. Those ATPs and NADPHs, you see those on the far right, they're going into the cycle. Those are the source of energy for this situation. Those are going to donate their energy. And as they donate it, they're going to add to the energy of the carbon molecules coming out of the carbon cycle. Ultimately, that is glucose. Okay. What they're doing is taking a bunch of $20 bills they made. That's that ATP. And they're making those stack of $20 bills into a $1,000 bill. That's all that's happening here. ATP is a short-term energy carrier. Like a $20 bill is a very small energy or small money carrier. They're converting those $20 bills into a $1,000 bill, which is the glucose. That is a long-term energy carrier. That's what's happening here. Okay, so what goes in is a short-term energy carrier and CO2. Short-term energy carriers. They're good sometimes, but not a lot of the time. A lot of times they're not that good. So we got to take that short-term energy carrier and we got to make a long-term energy carrier. Go from a lot of $20 bills to one $1,000 bill. And that's what's happening here. It's making glucose. Glucose is a long-term energy carrier. What comes out is long-term energy. Not only long-term energy, but the plant has other uses for glucose. Let's not forget that. Okay, it can take that glucose and combine it and make cellulose. Make cell walls from that. It can take that glucose and combine it and make starch, which is a nice long-term energy carrier, long-term energy source. You can store that away. There's a lot of things you can do with this glucose. We talked about the different pathways, the C4 pathway and the CAM pathway. These are just alternative pathways. These can help save the plant some energy. Okay? They're a little bit more efficient, so they're alternative energy pathways.